The antiques shop was mostly quiet. The dying sun of the afternoon twisted long shafts of shade through the high, dusty windows, the old timbers creaking quietly. Though it was late in the afternoon, and Daphne had one or two clients passing through, she had plenty of time to sit in her office, staring at the elaborate 17th century carved and gilt mirror that leaned against the wall. She was still shaken by Simon Blackwood's visit. She felt she was on the verge of something. As Daphne gazed into the mirror, she felt that there was wrong with her reflection. The image has a strange eeriness of itself, especially with her eyes in the reflection, as there was an unfriendly, piercing look about them that was uncharacteristic of Daphne. Yet, despite all of it, the image was intriguing and drawing Daphne closer and closer to the glass. With trembling fingers, Daphne reached out towards the mirror's surface. She stopped just short of touching it, remembering the strange visions she'd seen before. Part of her yearned to look again, but another part, a small voice of caution in the back of her mind, held her back, and she walked away to do some work. When she heard the bell above the shop door ring, she looked up to see Simon Blackwood had entered the crowded floor space, refining his steady gaze on the growing pile of vintage secondhand books she was sorting. He was taller than she was, casting a huge shadow. "Mr. Blackwood," Daphne greeted, her voice cautious. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Simon's smile was charming, but his eyes remained cold.
Mrs. Carlisle, I hope I'm not interrupting. I was passing by and thought I'd stop by to see if you'd reconsidered my offer.
Daphne shook her head. "I'm sorry, but as I said before, I don't have any mirrors matching your description."
Are you quite sure?
As Simon pressed, his gaze sweeping the shop.
Perhaps we could take another look around. I'd hate to think you might have overlooked something valuable.
"I appreciate your interest, Mr. Blackwood, but I know my inventory," Daphne replied firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Simon's smile became strained and he nodded.
Of course. I'll be going then. Good day, Mrs. Carlisle.
As Simon left, Daphne let out a sigh of relief. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the man. Pushing the thought aside, she returned to her work, losing herself in the task of cataloging and pricing. The hours stretched on and the shop grew quiet as dusk descended. So absorbed was Daphne in her task that she did not notice the figure slip through the back entrance in silence. Simon Blackwood, his erstwhile charm replaced with grim determination, crept noiselessly through the shop. He went into Daphne's office, and there it was, the ornate mirror, its surface seeming to shimmer in the dim light. Simon's eyes gleamed with triumph as he approached it.
Yes, at last,
he whispered, reaching out towards the glass. As his fingertips almost touched its surface, his reflection began to transform in the looking glass. In Simon's reflection, the full transformation shows him surrounded by immense wealth, holding large amounts of cash and gold. The mirror reveals glittering treasures, ancient artifacts, and a supernatural glow that hints at its dark power. Simon's reflection embodies greed and desire for material wealth, as if the mirror is tempting him with visions of grandeur. The eerie atmosphere, combined with the glowing mirror, creates a sense of foreboding, as Simon sees himself in a world of riches beyond imagination, lured by the mirror's dark magic. Then, it spoke to him in a voice of erotic invitation.
All this can be yours, power and riches, beyond your wildest dreams. All you need to do is touch the glass.
Gazing at the manifestation before him, Simon had leaned in so close that he barely noticed the footsteps approaching. Daphne, having heard a certain sound in her office, entered to find Simon there, with his hand stretched out before the mirror. "Mr. Blackwood," she yelled, "how dare you break into my office?" Startled, Simon spun around with a fierce expression on his face at having been disturbed and her causing the vision to disappear. He attacked Daphne suddenly, seizing her arms.
"You fool! Do you have any idea what you just cost me?"
Daphne struggled against his grip, fear and confusion warring within her. Just as Simon raised his hand to strike her, the shop's front door burst open. Gary entered, his face white with anxiety.
"Daphne, where are you? I have to warn you about the..."
His words were cut short as Simon, with surprising speed, snatched a large club from the shelf behind him and swung it at Gary's head. There was a horrible crunching sound and Gary dropped to the floor as if pole-axed. Simon drew near to her again, his eyes deranged.
"You think to hinder me? Well, you have failed, and this mirror is now mine."
Daphne backed away. She didn't know exactly what Gary had been trying to tell her, or why Simon was so anxious to possess the mirror, but she knew that Simon was moving towards her to kill her. As she struggled in front of the mirror with Simon, Daphne saw a glimpse of the future in the mirror's reflection, showing herself standing over Simon's prone form, a heavy brass candlestick clutched in her hand. The image was so vivid, so real, that she could almost feel the weight of the object in her grasp. It was as if the mirror was trying to help her, showing Daphne how to save herself. Without pausing, Daphne whirled around, her eyes fixed on the very candlestick she had seen in the vision. It stood on a shelf close at hand, shining dully in the failing light. She threw herself towards it at the same moment that Simon reached for her. Then the world seemed to grind to a halt as Daphne's fingers wrapped themselves around the cold metal she had in her hand. She whirled on her feet, the candlestick coming up swinging. It smacked into Simon's temple, cracking with a loud noise and causing his big brown eyes to bug out before lolling back inside his head. Then, he fell on his face to the floor, a limp noodle. Gasping for air, Daphne bent over Simon's body, the candlestick still held tightly in her hand. The shop was silent now, except for an old grandfather's clock and her own ragged breaths. A stillness fell around them in the old antique shop, which for some moments was punctuated only by her labored breathing. Simon remained unconscious on the floor, the lump of twisted brass candlestick still firmly gripped in her hand. But then, as her adrenaline rush ebbed, a fresh panic set in. Daphne's husband Gary was lying quietly still on the floor. "Gary!" Daphne dropped the candlestick and ran to his side. She cradled his head with gentle fingers. She felt for a pulse. It was there, but faint and fluttering. Blood was seeping from where Simon had struck him in a thin trickle. "Gary, wake up!" she called, swatting his cheeks. But he didn't respond. He was breathing shallowly, with great effort. Daphne's heart pounded with fear. Gary was in trouble and she had to think fast. She fumbled for her phone, ready to call for an ambulance, but then hesitated. The nearest hospital was at least 30 minutes away. What if the paramedics didn't arrive in time? She looked around frantically. Her eyes fell upon the gilt mirror that had started the nightmare. Could it save Gary now? The mirror had helped before. Maybe somehow it could show her what to do. Daphne stood in front of the mirror and took one last, despairing look at her husband before whirling around with a low moan and staring, fascinated, at her reflection in the shimmering surface of the mirror, now beckoning more insistently than ever. "Please," she whispered, staring into its depths, "show me how to help Gary." At first, there was an eerie silence and a long pause during which nothing was happening. And then, finally, just the beginning of an image was starting to form. Perhaps a solution, a way to save Gary, Daphne anxiously hoped. However, that was not the image that formed. Instead, the mirror, just like it had done the prior night, showed a newborn wrapped in a blanket with Daphne cradling the infant in her arms. The reflection showed her smiling with pure happiness. It was a complete joy that she had not felt in many months. The picture of a loving baby in her arms was everything she ever wanted, and it was slowly drawing Daphne in closer. Daphne's breath caught in her throat. It's her baby, the child she'd always dreamed of having but thought impossible. It looked so real, so perfect. She could almost hear its soft coos, feel its warmth against her chest. The mirror's image was completely overwhelming as Daphne started to slip into a trance. Unbeknownst to Daphne, within the mirror, the shadow weaver stirred. Centuries of captivity had made it cunning, patient. Now, sensing Daphne's vulnerability, it saw its chance for freedom. It poured its dark essence into the vision, enhancing every detail, making it irresistibly real. In the mirror, the baby opened its eyes, reaching out a tiny hand towards Daphne as she heard a voice, soft and alluring, whispering,
"This can be your future, Daphne. All you have to do is reach out and touch, and then your deepest desire will be made real."
Daphne leaned closer, her eyes wide with longing. The rest of the world seemed to fade away. Simon, the shop, even Gary. All that existed was this perfect vision, this promise of a dream fulfilled. Her hand lifted, moving towards the glass as if drawn by an invisible force. In the mirror, her reflection smiled encouragingly, the baby gurgling happily. Behind her, on the carpet, Gary's eyes were starting to open. Pain and dread rushed in along with the surge of consciousness. He could see Daphne standing before the mirror, her outstretched hand, as he remembered Mr. Gossage's dire warning.
Daph, no. Don't touch.
He said, in a low, rasped voice. But his voice faded out, and Gary's eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness once more. At that moment, the shop's bell chimed as a person entered. Hearing muffled noises from the back room, the handyman cautiously made his way towards the sound.
Miss Daphne?
He called out, pushing open the office door.
There is a package for you to sign. Is everything okay?
He saw a beautiful woman standing with her back to him, her long hair cascading down her back. Slowly, she turned to face him. The handyman's breath caught in his throat at the sight of her beauty, but there was something in her eyes that made him shiver.
Miss?
He asked again, uncertainly. Then the flesh-only Daphne smiled back, creasing in her cheeks but with soulless eyes, as she replied with a most sinister voice.
Yes, Mr. Johnson. Everything is perfectly fine now.
As the unsuspecting handyman smiled back, feeling relieved, the Shadow Weaver reveled in its newfound freedom in Daphne's body. After centuries of waiting, the world was finally within its evil grasp, and it had no intention of letting go. Then, it turned to the handyman and said,
There's a mirror in the back of my office. Store it in a crate, and oh, do be careful to not touch the glass.
Unnoticed by the handyman was the real Daphne, trapped inside the mirror with fists pounding against the glass to get out, and her face a mask of horror and despair. Meanwhile, in the physical world, all was quiet, and she could not be heard. Daphne's anguished face appeared briefly, a silent scream frozen on her lips, before fading into the glass, while free in the world, assuming Daphne's identity was the Shadow Weaver, whose reign of terror was about to be unleashed for the next 100 years. And there was nothing that anyone could do to stop it.